Okay, so welcome to this explainer of Prince Hans Adam II's really fascinating book, The State in the Third Millennium. You know, if you've ever stopped and wondered who the government actually works for, well, this analysis is going to completely flip your basic assumptions upside down. Whether you're a massive history buff, an economics nerd, or honestly just someone who thinks deeply about how we structure our societies, we're diving right into the author's historical breakdown. We're going to look closely at where the whole concept of the state is heading next.
To really set the stage here, we all know this incredibly famous quote from President John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address. He's calling on citizens to serve their nation. It's an idea that's inspired literally millions, this deeply held belief that it's our absolute duty to support, to protect, and to build up the state that we live in.
But what if we looked at it backwards? The author, who, by the way, spent years as an actual head of state, totally reverses this sentiment. He proposes a radical new motto. Ask what the state can do better for the citizen. The core argument here is that the state absolutely shouldn't be this massive, untouchable monopoly that we just blindly serve. No, instead, it's got to be a service company that works for us. Think of citizens as the shareholders. The state, it exists strictly to provide better services to you than any other organization possibly could.
So Part 1, Origins of the State. Let's look at how governments actually grew to be so massive.
To truly wrap our heads around this radical shift from a monopolistic master to a mere service provider, we have to look at the vast, wild scale of human history. Imagine all of it as just a single calendar year. If Homo erectus appearing 2 million years ago kicks off on January 1st, humanity spent almost the entire year as hunter-gatherers. I mean, it isn't until literally December 29th that agriculture even begins. And those massive agrarian-based states that totally dominate our history books, yeah, they don't take hold until December 31st. So these massive, heavily centralized governments, they are actually a remarkably recent, late December phenomenon in the grand scheme of human evolution.
Even way back in our earliest tribal days, all those long months before December 29th, survival really relied on 3 core organizational structures. First up was the monarchy, or basically the rule of a single person. Whether that was a hereditary chief or just an elected leader, early humans absolutely needed clear, decisive command structures. You needed that to plan complex hunts for large, dangerous animals and, well, just to ensure the group didn't die out.
Next, right alongside that single leader came the oligarchy, which really simply means the rule of the few. These were the utterly essential sub-leaders, right? Your medicine man, the hunt coordinators, the strategists. In basically any state throughout all of recorded history, you absolutely need this core group of technocrats. Because without them, the daily operations, the administration, the defense of the state, it simply can't function. It all falls apart.
And finally, there was democracy. In these small, tight-knit tribes, mutual trust allowed direct consensus to just thrive, mainly because populations were incredibly small and hyperlocal. But as the agricultural revolution just totally exploded our population numbers, things changed. You couldn't exactly gather hundreds of thousands of people in a single field to vote on things anymore. So, as states grew way too large for direct democratic voting, the ruling monarchies and oligarchies faced a huge problem. They desperately needed a new way to justify their immense power and their taxation to the massive crowds.
Which brings us to Part 2, Religion and Legitimacy, figuring out how to justify all that power. According to the historical view laid out in the book, religion became the absolute primary tool to legitimize laws and state authority for millennia. Think about it. If laws are supposedly divine decrees, and your monarch claims to literally descend from the gods, which we saw in ancient Egypt, Japan, the Americas, well, you're much more likely to obey, right? The Roman Empire was unbelievably successful at this. They'd often just seamlessly integrate the foreign gods of conquered peoples right into their own pantheon. It was a brilliant way to maintain societal stability over incredibly vast territories.
But then, as we entered the Middle Ages, this fascinating split happened. Over in the Eastern empires, you saw the state totally dominate religion. But Western Europe? They experienced this constant grinding tension between the spiritual power of the Pope and the secular power of emperors and kings. And the author suggests that this specific ongoing friction actually created a really unique space. It allowed for political diversity, economic freedoms, and the kind of rapid technological growth that eventually skyrocketed Europe onto the global stage.
Moving on to Part 3, Military Tech and Size. Let's see how technology actually dictates the shape of a state.
So ideology and religion definitely weren't the only things shaping how states evolved. A state's physical size is heavily dictated by a very practical reality: military tech. When high walls were the absolute best defense, small city-states thrived. When horses and cavalry were finally mastered, massive Asian nomadic empires were able to sweep across entire continents. Later, when the Turks and Europeans mastered artillery, those city walls became pretty much useless, heavily favoring massive, centralized states with huge industrial backing. But look at the modern era. Machine guns and later cheap anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. They've actually completely shifted the advantage back to smaller, defending nations and local infantry.
Fast forward to right now, today. The U.S. currently accounts for roughly 50% of global defense spending, with military technology now heavily favoring the defender, and the U.S. acting as this massive, non-territorially expansive superpower. The author argues something pretty controversial. He says other regions shouldn't totally bankrupt their citizens just trying to build a massive rival military superpower. The economic and military landscape of today just no longer demands that you have a massive standing army. Bigger is literally no longer better.
And that leads us to part 4, the democratic shift. Basically, how do you legitimize a government in the modern world?
With those military advantages shifting around and religious power fading significantly over the last few centuries, states faced a massive crisis of identity. The book argues that humanity first tried to replace religion with sweeping ideologies, things like nationalism and socialism. But as we've all seen, this led directly to the massive, totally horrific tragedies and bloodbaths of the 20th century. So with dynastic rule pretty much dead and those ideologies proving absolutely disastrous, democratic legitimation is kind of left standing as the only viable path forward for human society.
And the crucial, game-changing breakthrough for this was the 1776 American Revolution. The Founding Fathers proved that you could actually replace a religiously legitimized king with a democratically elected president. But here's the kicker. They still maintained stable, functional oligarchic structures, like the Senate and the Supreme Court, to prevent total anarchy. It became the ultimate blueprint, proving that democracy could actually work on a really large scale.
So bringing this all together, the author's ultimate solution for our future is to fundamentally shrink the state's monopoly. Because huge size is no longer an economic or military necessity, he argues states should be radically decentralized. By empowering local communities, we're talking down to the village or city level, with strict self-determination, large multi-ethnic states can actually avoid civil war and ethnic conflict. In this model, the state completely stops being this overarching controlling master. Instead, it finally becomes what we talked about at the very beginning, a peaceful service provider actively competing to offer you the best possible conditions.
And this brings us to a final, incredibly provocative thought to leave you with based on all this historical analysis. If the traditional state's monopoly is truly obsolete, and if smaller, highly decentralized communities can actually protect and govern themselves far better as shareholders, does humanity even wish to have a traditional state in the third millennium? It's a fascinating question, right? It completely upends our entire view of governance, asking us to demand so much more from the systems we build.